The year is 1241. Europe trembles as Mongol horsemen thunder across its plains. No army seems able to stop their advance. Their banners rise over shattered fortresses, leaving kingdoms in ruins. Within weeks, cities that had stood for centuries lie in ashes. Smoke blackens the sky as the Mongols impose their rule with ruthless efficiency. Fear spreads faster than their armies. For centuries, the name Mongol has evoked images of unparalleled conquest, a whirlwind of horsemen sweeping across continents, forging the largest contiguous empire the world has ever known. From the steppes of Mongolia, under the brilliant leadership of Genghis Khan, a force of nomadic warriors erupted, driven by a vision of universal dominion. Their lightning campaigns and innovative tactics reshaped the face of Asia, leaving an indelible mark on history. By the mid-13th century, their empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Central Europe. Russia, Persia, China, all had bent the knee to the Golden Horde. Their advance into Europe was swift and brutal, a terrifying new force against which the fragmented feudal armies seemed utterly helpless. The Battle of Mohi in 1241 saw the crushing defeat of Hungarian forces, opening the gates to the heart of the continent. Cities like Krakow and Budapest fell, their populations decimated, their ancient structures reduced to rubble. Panic seized the European nobility and common folk alike. Chroniclers of the time wrote of the scourge from the east, believing it to be the end of the world. Yet, as fate would have it, a crucial turning point arrived not from European resistance, but from within the Mongol Empire itself. In December of 1241, Ogidi Khan, the great Khan and son of Genghis, died in Mongolia. This event triggered the withdrawal of the main Mongol forces from Central Europe, as their leaders, including the formidable Batu Khan, were recalled to participate in the election of a new great Khan. Europe, battered and bruised, was granted a reprieve, an unforeseen stroke of luck that allowed its kingdoms to rebuild, regroup, and ultimately survive. But what if history had taken a different turn? What if Ogidi Khan had lived, or his death had not prompted the immediate recall of Batu's armies? What if the Mongol war machine, at the peak of its power and ferocity, had continued its relentless march westward, encountering no internal imperative to halt its progress? This is the alternate history we explore today. What if the Mongols had conquered all of Europe? It is a question that challenges our understanding of European identity, global power, and the very foundations of Western civilization. The echoes of such a conquest would resonate through the centuries, shaping not just the continent, but the entire world in ways almost unimaginable. Prepare to journey into a timeline where the crescent moon and the dragon banner fly over Paris, London, and Rome. We will delve into a world where the paths of East and West irrevocably converged under the thunder of hooves, a world transformed by a power that rewrote the maps of nations and the destinies of billions. This is the story of conquest, cultural clash, and the profound, enduring legacy of an empire that almost was. In our alternate timeline, the orders for withdrawal never came. The great Mongol army, led by the ruthless and brilliant Batu Khan, reinforced by fresh contingents, continued its advance from the plains of Hungary. The initial shock of Mohi had paralyzed much of Eastern Europe, and the fragmented kingdoms of the Holy Roman Empire, France, and Spain were ill-prepared for such a unified, disciplined, and utterly devastating foe. The Mongol strategy was always one of overwhelming force, psychological warfare, and unparalleled mobility. Their Tumans, units of 10,000 horsemen, could cover vast distances in days, appearing seemingly out of nowhere to encircle and destroy any opposing force. Feudal armies, reliant on heavy cavalry and static defenses, found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. Vienna, a crucial gateway to Western Europe, was the first major prize. Its walls, while formidable, had never faced siege engines of the Mongol caliber, perfected over decades of warfare against the sophisticated defenses of China and Persia. After a brutal siege, marked by waves of assaults and psychological terror, the city fell. Its capture sent shockwaves across the continent, shattering any lingering illusions of European invincibility. The fall of Vienna opened the floodgates. The Holy Roman Empire, a loose confederation of duchies and principalities, crumbled under the sustained assault. Emperor Frederick II, a shrewd but distant ruler preoccupied with Italian affairs, found his authority dissolve as one city after another capitulated. The Mongol advance was not a single, continuous line, but rather a series of sweeping movements, engulfing territories like a tidal wave. From Austria, separate Mongol detachments pushed into Italy, while the main force turned north into Bavaria and Swabia. Papal pleas for a grand crusade fell on deaf ears, as mutual distrust and rivalries among European monarchs prevented any coordinated defense. Each kingdom fought its own desperate, isolated battle, only to be systematically crushed. Northern Italy, with its wealthy city-states, presented a tempting target. Milan, Venice, and Florence, bastions of trade and early Renaissance culture, were systematically besieged and brought to heel. Their vast riches fueled the Mongol war effort and provided a massive influx of skilled artisans and engineers, invaluable resources for the burgeoning empire. Meanwhile, other tumans ravaged through Poland and Bohemia, eradicating any pockets of resistance. The Baltic Crusades were halted abruptly, as the Teutonic Knights and Livonian Order found themselves facing a far deadlier foe than the pagan tribes they had sought to convert. Their disciplined but small forces were simply overwhelmed. The Iberian Peninsula, though distant, was not spared. While initially focused on the heart of Europe, Mongol scouting parties and later full-fledged armies made their way through France and down into Spain and Portugal. The Reconquista was abruptly interrupted, as Christian and Muslim kingdoms alike found themselves united in a common, desperate, and ultimately futile defense against the new conquerors from the east. The ultimate prize, the symbolic heart of Western Christendom, was Rome. The Eternal City, with its ancient churches and the seat of the papacy, was besieged. After fierce resistance, the city fell, not with a whimper, but with a roar of destruction. The fate of the Pope and the cardinals remains a subject of historical debate in this timeline, but the symbolic blow to European morale was immeasurable. By 1248, roughly 7 years after the initial incursion, the vast majority of continental Europe, from the Atlantic coast to the Russian steppes, lay under Mongol dominion. England, protected by the Channel, remained an isolated outpost, but even its rulers began to send tribute, recognizing the inevitable. The map of Europe was redrawn, not by kings or emperors, but by the will of the Great Khan. The immediate conquest was not just about military might. It was about the psychological dismantling of an entire civilization. The brutality of the initial phase was intended to crush all hope of resistance, to instill a fear so profound that future generations would know only submission. This was not merely a change of rulers, it was the violent imposition of a new world order. With the Mongol banners flying over every major city, the immediate military phase ended, but a far more profound and insidious conquest began: the subjugation of the European spirit. At the heart of medieval European identity lay the Catholic Church. The papacy was not merely a religious institution, it was the ultimate arbiter of moral authority, the unifier of disparate kingdoms, and the very bedrock of European culture. The fall of Rome and the presumed fate of the Pope shattered this bedrock. The hierarchy of the Church, from archbishops to parish priests, was thrown into disarray. Without a central authority, the immense network of monasteries, cathedrals, and scholastic institutions, which had preserved learning and provided social cohesion for centuries, began to unravel. The Mongols, while generally tolerant of different religions within their empire, demanded absolute political loyalty. They viewed the Pope's authority as a direct challenge to the Great Khan's universal mandate. While they did not actively persecute Christians in the same way they might have crushed political rebels, they systematically dismantled the Church's temporal power, seizing vast lands and wealth. Churches were often repurposed, their bells melted down for other uses, their sacred sites sometimes used for Mongol rituals or administration. While Mass might still be tolerated in some areas, the very public display of Christian faith, especially any that implied a loyalty beyond the Khan, was suppressed. Without the unifying force of the papacy, the intricate web of European identity, woven from shared faith, language, and cultural practices, began to fray. The Crusades, once a rallying cry for all of Christendom, became a forgotten dream. pilgrimages to holy sites were disrupted, and the very concept of a shared European destiny began to fade under the shadow of the Golden Horde. Education, once largely the domain of the Church, suffered immensely. Universities like Paris, Oxford, and Bologna, centers of theological and philosophical debate, found their endowments seized, their scholars dispersed, and their curricula drastically altered. Mongol administrators, focused on practical knowledge, had little patience for scholasticism. Yet, the Christian faith did not vanish entirely. Instead, it went underground, adapting to survive. Local communities continued to practice their faith in secret, led by brave priests who risked their lives. Catholicism, once a grand public spectacle, became a private, intimate act of defiance and hope, passed down through generations. This underground resistance, however, was not unified. Without the papacy, various interpretations and splinter groups emerged, leading to a more fractured and diverse Christian landscape in the long term. The grand narratives of saints and miracles continued, but now imbued with a new sense of quiet martyrdom under foreign rule. European identity, once so deeply intertwined with Christendom, underwent a profound transformation. While shared suffering under Mongol rule created new communal bonds, the dream of a unified Christian Europe, the very concept of Europe as a distinct cultural and spiritual entity, was largely replaced by a series of regional identities defined by their relationship to the Mongol administration. The loss of the Church's temporal power also meant the loss of its role as a moral compass. Justice, once tempered by canon law, now adhered strictly to Yasa, the Mongol legal code. Feudal bonds of loyalty, often sanctified by religious oaths, were replaced by direct allegiance to the Khan. The very fabric of European society was rewoven, with faith relegated to a personal, rather than public sphere. The fall of Christendom was not a sudden, cataclysmic event, but a slow, grinding process of erosion. Over decades, the public memory of a free, Christian Europe faded, replaced by generations who knew only Mongol rule. The papacy, if it survived at all, became a shadow of its former self, a marginalized religious leader rather than a geopolitical power. This deep spiritual and cultural wound would never truly heal. It would leave a permanent scar on the European psyche, shaping its subsequent history in ways that would be unrecognizable to our own timeline. The lights of the Western world dimmed, not into total darkness, but into a different kind of illumination, one cast by the rising sun of the East. With conquest complete and the Church's power broken, the immediate period of brutal suppression gave way to the steady, albeit firm, establishment of Mongol administration. Life under Mongol rule in Europe was a complex tapestry of subjugation, adaptation, and unexpected change. The first generation experienced immense suffering, but subsequent generations knew only this new order. At the heart of Mongol governance was the Yasa, the legal code promulgated by Genghis Khan. This strict, universal law emphasized order, loyalty to the Khan, and a surprising degree of religious tolerance, as long as it didn't challenge Mongol authority. Banditry was severely punished, and trade routes, once perilous, became remarkably safe under the Pax Mongolica. The administrative structure was hierarchical, with local European nobles often retained in their positions, but always answerable to a Mongol daragachi, or governor. These governors, usually experienced Mongol or Turkic officials, wielded ultimate authority, collecting taxes, enforcing laws, and ensuring the smooth flow of tribute back to the great Khan's capital. Taxation was heavy. Europe's agricultural wealth and nascent industrial capacity were harnessed to serve the vast Mongol Empire. Grain, timber, iron, and a conscripted labor force were regularly extracted, leading to widespread poverty in many regions. However, this vast extractive system also necessitated better infrastructure, with roads and communication networks improved to facilitate control and movement of goods. Daily life for the common European peasant was marked by continuity and change. The rhythm of the seasons, the planting and harvesting, remained. But now, their surplus was often taken, their sons conscripted into labor battalions or even the Mongol army as auxiliary forces. Feudal obligations were replaced by imperial ones, often more demanding. Urban centers, especially those that had resisted most fiercely, faced long-term depopulation. But others, strategically important for trade or administration, experienced a different kind of growth, albeit one dominated by Mongol influence. New garrisons, markets catering to Mongol tastes, and administrative buildings altered the urban landscape. Culturally, a fascinating, if sometimes uneasy, fusion began. While the Mongols generally respected local customs, their presence introduced new foods, fashion, and even language. Turkic and Mongol words began to enter European vernaculars, particularly in areas related to administration, warfare, and horsemanship. Equestrian culture, already present in parts of Europe, became even more central. European horsemanship was refined by Mongol techniques, and the breeding of horses for speed and endurance became a priority. The sight of European auxiliaries riding alongside Mongol heavy cavalry became a common, if unsettling, spectacle. Religious tolerance, a hallmark of the Mongol Empire, meant that Christian communities, though disempowered, were generally allowed to practice their faith, albeit discreetly. This tolerance also brought new religions to Europe. Buddhists, Nestorian Christians from the East, and various Turkic animists all found their way into Mongol-controlled Europe, creating a far more religiously diverse continent. The long-term impact on social structure was profound. While the old feudal nobility largely remained, their power was now derived solely from the Khan. A new class of administrators, often European collaborators or Mongol-European mixed bloods, emerged, forming a crucial link between the rulers and the ruled. For the most part, life under Mongol rule was stable, albeit without the liberties and intellectual vibrancy that might have emerged in an independent Europe. It was a world of order, strict hierarchy, and a constant, underlying awareness of the omnipotent power of the Great Khan, whose decrees shaped every aspect of daily existence, from the largest trade deals to the smallest village dispute. The Mongol conquest of Europe, while devastating, inadvertently forged the greatest bridge between East and West that the world had ever seen. The Pax Mongolica, extending from the Pacific to the Atlantic, created an unparalleled zone of free trade, cultural exchange, and intellectual fusion. This was not a gentle blending, but a dynamic, often forced, intermingling of civilizations. The famous Silk Road, once terminating at the fringes of Europe, now extended deep into its heart. Chinese silks, spices from India, Persian rugs, and Central Asian horses flowed westward. In return, European wool, timber, ironware, and even specialized artisans were drawn eastward, feeding the demands of the vast Mongol Empire. With trade came ideas. Chinese advancements in printing, gunpowder technology, and navigation, previously slow to reach Europe, now arrived with unprecedented speed. The compass, paper money, and even early forms of banking, perfected in the East, began to permeate European society, transforming its technological and economic landscape. Gunpowder, initially used by the Mongols in siege warfare, rapidly spread throughout Europe. While initially a tool of subjugation, its availability would inevitably lead to European innovation, potentially creating entirely new forms of warfare and altering the balance of power within the empire itself in the long run. Beyond technology, there was an immense transfer of knowledge. Mongol courts, particularly at the capital of the Great Khan, attracted scholars, astronomers, physicians, and artists from across their vast domain. European thinkers, once isolated in their own scholastic traditions, now encountered Arabic mathematics, Persian medicine, and Chinese philosophy. Astrology, cartography, and medicine all experienced a dramatic cross-pollination. European maps, once rudimentary, rapidly improved with the influx of Asian cartographic knowledge. Herbal medicine from both East and West merged, creating a more comprehensive approach to health. The linguistic landscape also changed. While Latin and vernacular languages persisted, a lingua franca, a blend of Turkic, Persian, and Mongol, became essential for trade and administration across the empire. Educated Europeans would learn these languages, opening up new avenues for communication and understanding. Architectural styles began to blend. While grand European cathedrals might not be built, existing ones were often adapted, and new administrative buildings and palaces incorporated elements of Mongol and Central Asian design, creating a unique Euro-Mongol aesthetic. The gur, the traditional Mongol tent, became a surprisingly common sight across the European plains. This era was not just about the East influencing the West. European metallurgical skills, shipbuilding techniques, and agricultural practices also traveled eastward, enriching other parts of the Mongol Empire. It was a two-way street, though the dominant flow of influence initially came from the more advanced civilizations of the East. The fusion was most evident in the major administrative centers and garrison cities, where communities of Mongols, Turks, Persians, Chinese, and Europeans lived side by side. These melting pots created a new, hybrid culture, where traditional European customs were mixed with Eastern philosophies, artistic expressions, and culinary traditions. This extraordinary, forced globalization, ushered in by the Mongol conquests, fundamentally reshaped the trajectory of European development. It short-circuited centuries of isolated European progress and instead plunged the continent into a rapid, intense period of cross-cultural fertilization, laying the groundwork for a truly globalized intellectual and technological landscape, albeit one under imperial control. The conquest of Europe by the Mongols did not merely redraw the map of a continent, it fundamentally reshaped global geopolitics, creating a world order vastly different from our own. The immediate consequence was the solidification of the Mongol Empire as the undisputed hegemon, a true global superpower whose reach extended further than any empire before or since. The Middle East, in our timeline, saw the Mamluks of Egypt eventually halt the Mongol advance at Ain Jalut in 1260. But in this alternate history, with Europe subdued, the full might of the Mongol war machine could be brought to bear. The Mamluks, without the relief of internal Mongol distractions, would likely have fallen, bringing Egypt and North Africa into the Mongol sphere. This means not only a Mongol presence across the Levant, but also potentially pushing across the Sahara into West Africa, following lucrative trade routes for gold and slaves. Imagine Mongol governors in Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad, ruling over an even vaster, more religiously diverse empire. Asia, already largely under Mongol rule, would see its position solidified. China, under the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol dynasty in China, would flourish as the eastern heart of this immense empire. Its wealth, technology, and cultural influence would further disseminate westward, accelerated by the seamless connectivity. India, in our timeline, largely escaped direct Mongol conquest. Here, however, with the absence of Mamluk resistance and an even stronger, unified Mongol power base, incursions into the subcontinent become more likely. The fragmented Indian kingdoms might have found themselves facing the same overwhelming force that swept through Europe. The Indian Ocean trade network, once dominated by Arab and Indian merchants, would now see Mongol-backed enterprises and even direct Mongol naval presence, extending their economic and political influence further south and east into Southeast Asia. England, though spared direct conquest due to its island geography, would exist in a state of perpetual deference. Its independent spirit would be curtailed, its trade routes subject to Mongol control, and its foreign policy dictated by the Great Khan. It would be a prosperous but subservient province in all but name, likely paying tribute and sending representatives to the Great Khan's court. The world map would be dominated by one contiguous, immense political entity. This would eliminate many of the historical conflicts that shaped our world. No 100 Years' War, no Wars of the Roses, no major European colonial expansion as we know it. The focus of global power would be firmly internal to the Mongol Empire. Without independent European powers, the age of exploration as we understand it would never occur. There would be no Columbus funded by the Spanish monarchs, no Portuguese circumnavigating Africa. Instead, any exploration would be sanctioned and directed by the Mongol state, likely focused on mapping their vast empire and securing new trade routes within its existing sphere. This global shift would also have profound ecological consequences. The unified administration could lead to massive infrastructure projects on an unprecedented scale, impacting forests, rivers, and agricultural lands across continents. The rapid spread of diseases, as seen in our own timeline's Black Death, could become even more devastating across such a vast, interconnected landmass. The global power shift would mean a world of unprecedented interconnectedness, but one dominated by a single, powerful authority. It would be a world of enforced peace, vast trade, and cultural diffusion, but also one lacking the vibrant, competitive dynamism of independent nation-states, which in our timeline spurred innovation and diverse political thought. Fast forward to the modern era, perhaps the 21st century in this alternate timeline. What would a world shaped by centuries of Mongol dominion over Europe look like? The very concept of Europe as a distinct cultural entity, as we know it, would likely not exist. Instead, we would have Western Khanate, or European Ulus, a region within a vast, unified Eurasian superstate. Languages would be profoundly different. While local vernaculars might persist, a dominant Eurasian lingua franca, possibly a descendant of Turkic or Mongol with heavy Persian and even some European influences, would be the language of power, education, and international trade. English, French, German, these might be niche regional dialects, not global languages. Religion would be far more diverse. Christianity would likely be a minority faith, perhaps one of many, including various forms of Buddhism, Islam, and indigenous animist beliefs, all coexisting under the tolerant, yet politically demanding, umbrella of the Great Khan's rule. There would be no dominant global religion, but rather a kaleidoscope of spiritual traditions. Politically, the world would be a true empire, perhaps a loose federation of semi-autonomous khanates, but all ultimately subservient to the Great Khan, whose lineage might still trace back to Genghis. Democracy as we understand it would be a foreign concept, replaced by a system emphasizing stability, hierarchy, and imperial loyalty. Technology would have progressed, but perhaps along different vectors. While the initial Mongol conquest brought rapid technological transfer, the lack of competitive, independent nation-states might have stifled the fierce innovation driven by rivalry in our timeline. Space exploration, for instance, might be focused on resource extraction within Earth's orbit, rather than a race to the moon. The arts would reflect this vast cultural synthesis. Music, literature, and visual arts would draw from a reservoir of Eurasian traditions, creating forms unrecognizable to us. Imagine symphonies blending Eastern modes with Western orchestration, or epic poems weaving together European sagas with Central Asian oral traditions and Chinese calligraphy. Socially, the centuries of intermarriage and cultural blending would have created a profoundly mixed populace. The concepts of distinct races as we understand them would be far more fluid, replaced by a complex tapestry of regional and familial identities shaped by a shared imperial heritage. Education would emphasize practical skills, imperial history, and a broad, pan-Eurasian curriculum. Universities, if they existed, would be centers of imperial knowledge, fostering loyalty and contributing to the empire's technological and administrative needs, rather than serving as bastions of independent critical thought and dissent. Economically, this mega-empire would likely be a single, vast market, perhaps with regional specialization but without the nationalistic trade barriers of our world. Global supply chains would be truly integrated, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, moving goods and resources with unparalleled efficiency under central control. Environmental policy, too, would be managed on an imperial scale. While potentially leading to massive resource exploitation, it could also implement continent-wide conservation efforts or infrastructure projects unimaginable in a fragmented world. The scale of human impact on the planet would be magnified, for better or worse. This alternate future, therefore, is one of immense unity and centralized power, a truly globalized civilization achieved not through collaboration, but through conquest. It is a world of stability and order, but perhaps at the cost of the vibrant, sometimes chaotic, diversity and independent evolution that characterized our own timeline. We have journeyed through a world fundamentally reshaped by a single historical pivot, the continued Mongol advance into Europe. From the thunder of hooves over shattered cities to a modern Eurasian superstate, the ripple effects of that alternate conquest are staggering, reminding us of the fragility of history and the profound impact of unforeseen events. This thought experiment is more than just a captivating tale of what might have been. It serves as a powerful reminder of how deeply interconnected our societies are, how culture, religion, and politics are woven into the very fabric of identity. The loss of a unified Christendom, the fusion of East and West, these are not merely academic exercises but profound reflections on what defines us. In our own timeline, Europe's fragmented resistance and the fortuitous death of Ogdi Khan allowed a different path to unfold. It allowed for the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Exploration, and the eventual rise of independent nation-states whose rivalries and innovations ultimately shaped the modern world. Our alternate history presents a stark contrast, a world of stability and vast integration, but perhaps one that sacrificed dynamism and unique cultural evolution for the sake of imperial order. It makes us appreciate the peculiar, often chaotic, path our own history took, with all its triumphs and tragedies. The lessons for today are clear. The forces of globalization, cultural exchange, and imperial ambition are ever present. Understanding how easily history could have veered in a different direction encourages us to critically examine the present, to cherish the unique aspects of our own cultures, and to reflect on the nature of power and its consequences. The thunder of Mongol hooves may have faded into distant memory in our world, but their potential impact on Europe remains a haunting echo, a powerful "what if" that forever alters our perception of history. It reminds us that the past is not a fixed narrative, but a delicate balance of choices, accidents, and the relentless march of human ambition. And as the sun sets on this alternate European Ulus, we return to our own present, perhaps with a renewed appreciation for the world we inhabit, a world forged by different paths, different struggles, and a history that, by a thread, turned out to be our own.